So we're going to move from the United States and think about some of these issues comparatively. So we have two papers. The first by, and I'm going to probably butcher some of these names, Kemal, Kivanç, Aköz, Ekim Arbatli, and Dina Rosenberg. And the second by Monika Nalepa from the University of Chicago and her grad student, Epak Sinar. I thought we'd start with the Divide and Conquer paper, Divide and Conquer, Presidents, Parliaments, and Political Polarization During Electoral Campaigns. And after these two papers, we'll have, as our discussant, Meng, who's from the University of Virginia, residing temporarily in Austin, Texas. So the first paper, Divide and Conquer, it's going to be a three-person effort, as I understand it, correct? Okay, so I turn it over to you.
As Jeff has already mentioned, we are moving away from the United States in this paper, and very clearly so. We look at the problem of polarization cross-nationally. Most of the literature that exists on the topic to this day really focuses on American politics. However, we know that political polarization now is a global phenomenon, right? It's touching the whole world, basically. And in many countries, we also notice that political polarization has become a big problem of authoritarian backsliding, right? So essentially, if you look at the trajectories of countries like Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey, right? So these are all countries that have experienced in the past decade both increasing levels of political polarization and alarming trends of autocratization. So these also tend to go hand in hand. Of course, political polarization is defined in many ways and can be defined in many ways. In this paper, we strictly refer to mass polarization. So we do not talk about elite polarization. We do not talk about party platform polarization. So it's specifically societal. And the way that we understand it is very much inspired by Esteban and Rey's understanding of political polarization. So we are talking about individuals who are grouped into clusters, such that each cluster would be very similar in terms of the attributes of the member inside it, but different clusters would be very different from one another. Right? So these two things simultaneously. I will not spend too much time on the determinants of polarization, but again, if you look outside of American politics, you're going to notice that cross-national studies that look at the determinants of polarization systematically are unfortunately very rare, right? Again, we're seeing more efforts in the past maybe decade, but still there's a lot to be done. And what seems to be getting a bit more attention is economic factors. So we do have a few studies that focus on the role of socioeconomic inequality, unemployment, etc. So such factors on political polarization. A few studies, again, that talk about the links between elite polarization and mass polarization. Then we have studies on social media and, like the recent forms of media and how those can affect polarization in countries. Unfortunately, not a lot on institutional arrangements. So what we propose to do, what we try to do in this paper is to look at one specific institutional arrangement, which is the government type, and try to see whether there is a difference between presidential versus parliamentary regimes in how they might affect levels of mass polarization in societies. Obviously, there are many ways through which institutions might work, right? So, a party of political scientists here, nobody will be surprised when we say institutions matter, right? But how do they matter exactly? That's the question. And we are looking at one specific mechanism here, which is the type of executive elections, right? So presidential versus parliamentary elections, and specifically how the electoral campaigns are run across different government types, right? So how do the electoral campaigns basically differ in presidential versus parliamentary regime? So obviously the most famous theory here comes from Linz, although to our knowledge, it hasn't been systematically tested. We can empirically also observe that presidential systems seems to be more highly polarized than parliamentary systems overall. Being inspired by Linz, right? So the main explanations would be, well, first of all, the presidential system, right, which Linz refers to the perils of, right? It actually is a two-dimensional system, right? So the winner takes all, losers have to wait their turn, and that turn is pretty long because the presidential mandate is fixed. So essentially that creates a problem for the losers. They get no access to decision-making, no access to executive power for a fixed term of 4 to 5 years. Recently, other scholars have also mentioned that majoritarian electoral rules, which are usually associated with these systems, also seem to create the problem of disproportional representation, and hence they can exacerbate polarization as well. So that's another potential link. Another angle to think about is that we know usually candidates that are outsiders, right, regime outsiders or political outsiders with little experience in politics are more likely to be found in presidential elections than in parliamentary elections. So usually in parliamentary regimes, since who's being elected is the party and the prime minister subsequently, most of the time you will find politicians that have risen through the ranks of the party for it. Like they've been involved in politics for extended periods of time, usually started young, right? So they have more policy experience. This can mean two things. First of all, obviously, outsider candidates might also mean more radical candidates, right? Candidates with maybe more extreme positions, non-systemic candidates, right? As we've seen with examples like, I don't know, Hugo Chavez, Trump, right? So again, Erdogan in Turkey. So all of these can happen. But also, even in instances where outsider candidates are more willing to negotiate, right, or more willing to form coalitions, they may lack the experience to do so. So essentially, right, I mean, I won't spend too much more time on this. A lot of studies already tell us that electoral campaigns in the period that they happen already divide and antagonize the electorate, right? So they're divisive to begin with. We also had another layer saying that presidential elections can potentially be more divisive. So the question that we're trying to answer here is why? Why are presidential elections more divisive? We will here offer first a model and then some empirical analysis to test our premises that, you know, government type essentially can affect polarization through two separate outcomes. The first one would be the informativeness level of the candidate's campaign, and the second one would be the voters' level of responsiveness to new information in a system. So Kivanç will take over from here with the model.
So I have more material than I will talk about, but I just wanted to have all of the material here. Okay, so here to form the formal argument here, we propose an information environment, and in particular a disclosure environment. And the motivation here is that usually, you know, informational environments are not, you know, friends for, are not, you know, typical places, typical environments that will breed polarization, because, you know, full information would lead to complete agreement, no polarization, and no information during election campaigns would lead to no change in polarization, right? But we argue here that, you know, that the presidential elections in particular may actually lead to environments with partial information, and we show that actually, you know, at least in this particular, you know, very stylized model, this partial information environment actually leads to some non-monotonic relation between, you know, the initial polarization and the posterior polarization. So the idea is that we have some states of the world. You know, there is something unknown about the country and the economy. And well, each of these states could, you know, capture or summarize something like, you know, the likelihood of economic recession, you know, the domestic or international security risks, and, you know, and this and that, right? And each of these states basically correspond to some, you know, most viable, you know, most sensible policy. And And so that, this policy works in a sense the best if this state of the world is. So then we assume that, each political party is, simply characterized by their policy commitment. So they formed around a particular policy position, and each of these political parties could be right in some state of the world with some positive, positive probability, right? We have a large set of voters, and each voter has an opinion about the states of the world, what is really going on with the economy and, the political situation and etc. And we basically model opinion here as the most likely state of the world. So basically the voters have some, opinion about, which policy should be the best one, right? So in a sense, priorly, they are, supporting a particular political party position. So given that, actually, we define, prior belief as a probability distribution, and basically they look, something like this. So we basically have a single picked prior distribution. So this is an example with 4 states of the world. So for example, this we have a cluster of voters around, let's say, the second state of the world, omega-2 here, and they believe that the second state is the most probable state. So that means they are basically supporting, unless they are provided further information, they are basically supporting the political party that supports the policy that is associated with the second state of the world. So given that, we, just to make things a bit concrete and simple, actually, we just basically picked the parliamentary elections as the benchmark case, as the baseline case, where we assume that, during parliamentary elections, political parties do not share any further information. They just, announce their policy positions, and, voters basically just, do not learn anything new about the state of the world. They might be informed about, the policy positions of the parties, and they might form their, opinions accordingly, but there is no additional information about this unknown, state of the world and the corresponding, policy. And that translates in our model that the prior opinion distribution also gives us the voter shares in parliamentary distribution, right? So basically, suppose that we have a distribution of opinions like this. So we have a cluster of opinions at the, let's say, left extreme with 20% of the votes, and most of the voters have relatively moderate views here in this particular example, and we have some, let's say, right-wing extremists, right? And then based on this prior opinion distribution, we can also calculate the prior opinion polarization level by using the famous formula by Esteban and Ray, right? Which basically takes, how dispersed the voter shares are, but also how distant their positions are from each other, right? And in this particular case, for example, the initial political polarization would be equal to around 36%. Okay. So given that, now we introduce presidential elections. In presidential elections, we assume that, the voters can actually change their opinions. And the idea is as follows. So the presidential, candidates do some research before elections. They collect some information about the state of the world. And they basically choose how to run their electoral campaigns. And in particular, we are assuming the following, right? So in each presidential candidate basically just still commits to a particular policy position, but she can choose the disclosure level during the electoral campaign, right? So whether the electoral campaign should be an informative one, sort of fact-based and etc., versus an uninformative one, so that it is more policy-based and so on and so forth, right? And this particular, simple formalization or stylized formalization of presidential candidates enables us to characterize presidential election campaigns as just the sets of informative messages that are disclosed during the campaign period. So basically, technically, this is just, each presidential election is just a set of messages that provide some further information about the best policy and the corresponding state of the world. So in this construction, we have the most intuitive result here. So each presidential candidate basically shares some additional information only if that information basically benefits her, right? And in this particular case, it translates to the following. So each presidential candidate receives an informative signal, and if this signal actually coincides with the policy that the candidate is going to implement if she is elected, then she discloses this information and tries to convince voters, persuade voters. Otherwise, they just choose to implement non-informative campaigns. Then voters' responses to these their changes in opinion after these presidential election campaigns depends on how informative these signals could be, how flexible their beliefs are, and etc. Right? So this was just going through the same example here. So this was the prior opinion distribution, right? So suppose that we have a presidential election where we have just one presidential candidate who runs an informative campaign, right? And well, that candidate is the one that supports the policy, that argues for the policy that is associated with, in this case, omega-2, right? So basically, in this particular case, and under this parametric restrictions here, all of the voters that are close enough to this particular policy position, they just move to this new informative state. So they start to think that maybe omega-2 is the most likely state. But this small group of voters, their ideologies are already very far away. They are far enough that they do not change their opinions, right, after receiving this information. Well, in this particular case, well, we see a clear polarization here, instead of the positions, but the share inequality is too high to generate high polarization levels. So the total aggregate polarization level is actually lower after candidate presidential election campaigns. But what if, for example, the message is just omega-3, the third presidential candidate is the one who runs the informative campaign, and in this case we have a similar dynamic here. Now most of the people are clustered around this particular state of the world, and in this case, since the distribution is slightly more equal between these two extremes, relatively two extremes, now the resulting polarization is actually higher, right? And basically, this basically tells us that the presidential elections probabilistically can generate higher polarization and lower polarization. Just to get a measure that is independent of these probabilistic events, what we do is as follows. We calculate the expected posterior polarization. So basically what we do is that for each state of the world, we calculate the corresponding probabilities of each of these, presidential candidate outcomes, right? So how informative this presidential election, elections are, right? Election campaigns are. And then based on these probabilities, we calculate the corresponding posterior polarization. We do the weighted sum, and then for each state we have an expected polarization level. Then we use the uniform prior distribution over the states, and then calculate the prior expected posterior polarization. And this is sort of what we get, right? So what we find is as follows, right? So basically we have the initial polarization, and this green line is our baseline, which also represents the parliamentary system here. So whenever the initial polarization is relatively lower, we usually have in most of our scenarios here, we usually have a positive change in polarization, right? So we expect to see that these cases where there is higher polarization have higher probabilities, and they contribute more to the expectation of the polarization. So the expected change in polarization here is relatively positive. But when the initial polarization is high enough, well, in particular, there is actually a threshold, and this threshold depends on the particular parameter values here. And when the initial polarization is actually high enough, the resulting polarization is actually lower than the initial polarization. So based on these observations, we come up with these two hypotheses here. So all else equal, presidential elections change the posterior level of polarization in a country with higher probability than parliamentary elections, right? And also, if the initial polarization is in a country is low, then the presidential campaigns tend to increase the posterior level of polarization, at least in relative to parliamentary regimes. So that's basically the theory. So let's move on to the interesting part and empirical analysis.
So now that we generated that we generated hypotheses, it's time to see whether the data support them. So we ran the regression analysis. We have 89 countries, 1946, 2019. Of course, we only use election years since we are interested in the impact of the elections. So we use the binomial logistic regression analysis because our main dependent variable is binary. We constructed our main dependent variable as a change in polarization level between the year of election and the preceding year. So we're not interested in the level of polarization per se, but I want to emphasize it. We are interested in whether elections are associated with the change in polarization. So we, on the basis of the polarization measure coming from the VDEM, which is the answer to the question whether society is polarized into antagonistic, hostile political camps, which is exactly how we conceptualize polarization. We derive two measures. One is stable polarization, and the other one is increasing polarization. Both of them are binary. So our main independent variable is the type of executive elections, and we control for all the usual suspects from the literature. So here are our main results. So here the dependent variable is stable polarization. As you can see, parliamentary elections are associated with no change in polarization as predicted by our model. And here our dependent variable is increasing polarization. So we see that initial low level of polarization leads to increasing polarization. And also we see that presidential elections are associated with increasing polarization. And probably our most important result is when we add interaction between presidential elections and the initial level of polarization. Next slide, please. So in order to interpret interaction term, we built a marginal effect graph, and you can see clearly that when the level of polarization is low, presidential elections are much more likely than parliamentary elections to be associated with higher political polarization. And when the initial polarization is high, then there is no effect, which we think is logical because it's already high. These are our main results. And next, please. So to conclude, we found that elections under different institutional settings and the level of initial polarization affect posterior polarization. And it is exactly presidential elections rather than parliamentary elections that are associated with higher level of political polarization. So we think that since polarization is harmful for democracies, we think that the future research should probably see what can be done to mitigate this type of polarizing, divisive rhetoric during the campaigns.
Thank you, and no worries on time. My goof made everybody a few minutes late. So now we turn to the University of Chicago and Monika and Ipek.
So this is joint work with Ipek Chinar, who is here among the panelists, and it's actually a short paper. So I'm going to give myself 20 minutes, but it shouldn't take that long. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on polarization as the cause of democratic backsliding in the newest literature on political economy, which is actually been developing pretty robustly in the sense that people know about each other's work and discuss it. So one of the things that comes out of that literature is that there's actually no consensus about the effect of polarization as contributing or decreasing backsliding. On the one hand, there's a work by Milan Svalik, who interprets polarization as the distance between an ideological incumbent and challenger, and he finds that that makes the representative citizen more likely to trade democracy for ideological proximity. So he basically re-elects a backsliding autocrat to avoid an ideological challenger who's very far away from winning. But then on the other hand, there's a paper by Grillo and Prato, who in one of their subcases find that polarization, interpreted this time as polarization in the mass electorate, decreases the incumbent's temptation to backslide to authoritarianism because it reduces the support of an incumbent who's aspiring to be autocrat. And then there's another paper with yet another interpretation of polarization. This time is the ideological distance between a representative citizen and opposing challenger. And this group of authors, myself included, finds that polarization increases the chances of backsliding. In some instances, what this literature is talking about is polarization of elites that we can think of as follows. So here, the blue line represents the distribution of the electorate, and it's the same on both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. But the elites, so the two parties, this is just a simplified picture. Trust me, we're going to move to many more than two parties very soon. But the parties' positions vis-a-vis each other are different. So in the polarized case, they're separate. In the not polarized case, they're close to one another. But on the other hand, we could also have polarization of voters or the mass public, where the parties are exactly in the same position, but the mass public is moving apart from one another, or it's basically centered with the centers of the distribution kind of right above the ideal points of the parties. So the question that often emerges is, well, which comes first? Is it the polarization of voters that drives the polarization of parties, or is it the polarization of parties that drives the polarization of voters? And this is a interesting question, and it's one of the motivations behind looking at polarization as a driver of backsliding in Poland. Okay, but just like one slide about polarization, state of the discipline. So I think we think that from our sort of like brief reading of the literature that empiricists have mostly focused on elite polarization, and this is the work basically using W-nominate scores to analyze the U.S. Congress. Measuring mass polarization, if has been practiced at all, it seems to have mostly focused on the US, though there are some notable exceptions, such as Constanza Schreiber. And even in Eastern Europe, where recently there are ample cases of democratic backsliding, there have been very few attempts, with the notable exemption of the paper just presented, to measure polarization prior to 2015. Which is very puzzling, because if democratic backsliding is a gradual process, and if polarization is one of its causes, then we should have seen the antecedents of polarization much sooner. And to be fair, if polarization has been studied in Eastern Europe, it's been under a completely different interpretation. So there's a very neat paper by Tim Fry from 2002, where he talks about polarization as basically the instances of divided government, when the legislature was dominated by one party and the presidential and the executive was dominated by another party. Or it's also been studied as a positive feature of the electoral system. So this is the work of Kitschelt and his co-authors, where he actually includes as a measure of programmatic representation, polarization, by arguing that, well, if parties are not differentiated amongst each other, then voters don't have a real choice. So polarization in that literature was actually a good thing. So not much on Eastern Europe. Okay, so now we're going to pivot to Eastern Europe. Here are some very sad scenes from the eastern border of the EU from literally just a few days ago, where there is a refugee crisis. There are imported refugees on the Belarusian side of the EU border who are trying to get into Poland and down the line into the EU. And the Polish government is preventing them from entering. Those refugees are being flown from the Middle East by Lukashenko, who is trying to basically get the EU to reverse sanctions that have been imposed on him. So he's basically manufactured a refugee crisis. And this is probably the height of the extent to which the European Union has polarized Polish society, because on the one hand, the ruling Peace Party, so the populist ruling party, is blaming Lukashenko for the crisis, but also EU for imposing the sanctions in the first place, while the liberals, so the opposition to peace, are blaming peace for basically not letting the refugees enter and not treating them in a humanitarian way according to the Geneva Convention. Everybody's blaming Lukashenko, though. But it didn't used to be this way. The EU is not always a polarizing issue. In fact, at the time of the transition to democracy in the early 90s, there was a very wide consensus that joining the EU is a good thing. So until actually the negotiations about accession terms began in earnest, which was sort of like in the early 2000s, neither the political elites nor the mass public really had much differentiated views on what the EU means. So in that sense, the EU is actually a perfect example of a new cleavage, which I see as very similar to the saloon example from Sundquist's lovely book, which I like to teach even in comparative politics classes, Dynamics of the Party System. And it allows us to actually evaluate these rival hypotheses about which kind of polarization causes which. So on the one hand, as a reminder, there's this hypothesis that mass polarization on the EU question preceded party polarization. So Markowski and Tucker, in their work on the EU cleavage in Eastern Europe, call this hypothesis Downsian parties. And the idea here is that first, the mass public differentiates on accession to the EU question, and then parties, in order to sort of capture that electorate, also polarized following the mass polarization. And then on the other hand, there's another theory, which Ipek actually writes about in her dissertation, but also corresponds to the responsible parties hypotheses from Markowski and Tucker, where party elites actually find an exogenous issue, such as EU accession, and they actually use it to drive a wedge within the electorate, causing preferences of the mass public to polarize. So initially there's elite polarization and mass polarization follows. So what we're going to use to evaluate these two hypotheses is a series of public opinion poll surveys conducted by CEBOS, which is a nearly 40-year-old institution whose independence is actually written into Polish law. And they about every month conduct face-to-face interviews on nationally representative samples of polls. And the survey is called Political Preferences of Polls. So they always ask the same one set of questions, which is constant across all surveys, but then they also add sort of like specific questions to tailor to whatever is going on at a given time. So we will use data from a decade that includes 5 years preceding EU accession and 5 years following the EU accession. Now, questions regarding the EU were not asked in every single of those monthly surveys. So instead, what we did is we picked out the surveys for where questions regarding attitudes to the EU were taken. But the key question is that we're going to use is the one about political preferences. So if the elections to the Sejm and Senate, same as the lower house of the Polish parliament and Senate, were to take place this Sunday, which party would you vote for? So this actually just shows the first third of our surveys. And these lines here are our parties, and this shows the percentage of voters or of respondents who indicate wanting to vote for that party. And one thing you see is there are a lot of parties. Another thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that this line, this orange line here, that is sloping downwards, at least in the first term. So this is just the period from January 2001 to December 2004. This is the successor Communist Party, the SLD. And that is because in this first period of the early 2000s, the Polish party system was still organized according to the regime divide. So party based on affiliation with the former authoritarian party or parties opposed to the former authoritarian party. But then towards the 2000, here in 2003, that regime divide dissipates and you have sort of normal parties emerging. So the blue party here are the Liberals, the PO, which is also currently in power. So I'll just zoom very quickly, show the sort of like crystallization of the party system here in the second term, covering our surveys where there's PO and PiS, basically, the current ruling party and its opposition having most representation, and all the way here to the seventh term, so 2007 through October 11th, where the Liberals basically dominated over PiS, and the blue party here is PiS. So these are all the surveys. But from those surveys, we focus now on questions measuring attitudes to the EU. And we look at 3 questions. So first we look at self-placement on a 7-point scale from Poland's EU membership will confer more benefits than costs to Poland's EU membership will bring more costs than benefits. So basically Euroscepticism increases on the higher end of the scale and decreases on the lower end of the scale. And this is a question about sort of like unspecified benefits. Like we don't know relative to what those benefits and costs are being measured. The second question is an interesting one because it asks about a self-placement on a scale from benefits relative to existing members. So here the focus seems to be, is Poland losing or benefiting more than other members of the EU, presumably in Western Europe? And then finally, the third question asks about self-placement on a scale from, for me personally, EU membership will bring more costs than benefits. So here asking respondents basically to be sort of like introspective. Now, what we did with these attitudes questions is first we partitioned our respondents according to the previous question that I showed you. So the intention, the party they intend to vote for. So we zoomed into only the top 6 parties in each of in the decade starting in 2000 and ending in 2011, and looked at the distribution of electorates of those 6 parties on these 3 questions. So I'm going to start first with the question about unspecified benefits. So we have, again, 9 surveys among those not hundreds, but tens of surveys that I showed you before, because these are the 9 surveys where these EU accession questions were answered, were asked. And there are 6 parties here, so there are 6 lines in each of these graphs. And let me just talk you through these parties. So the top 2 here are basically agrarian parties. And then the middle, the green parties here are old liberal parties. PO is the new liberal party. And then PiS is the current ruling party, so the populist party of Jarosław Kaczyński, and LPR is an even more traditionalist party. Now, what we expect to get from these graphs is we want to see whether mass polarization preceded elite polarization. So in 2000, it seems that parties are not, that electorates are not really differentiating on this question about unspecified benefits, right? I mean, it's very hard to tell the electorates of these parties apart. And this remains pretty flat until here in 2004, we see that the electorate of the liberals becomes sort of an EU enthusiastic more. And this is indeed sort of the height of the moment. This is basically the first few months following the EU referendum. So definitely following the moment when the party elites differentiated on the EU topic. And I should have said that PiS and LPR are the Eurosceptic parties here. And this trend seems to continue here with the liberal parties sort of being more enthusiastic, also here in 2006 and in 2009. In 2011, one of the agrarian parties is sort of like clearly showing more skepticism than enthusiasm, but not really much to write home about in terms of, well, the electorates were clearly divided before the height of the EU accession debate. So let's take a look at the benefits relative to other countries. So this is an interesting picture because because what seemed to be driving the anti-EU rhetoric of the Eurosceptical party, so PiS and LPR, was precisely that Poland is losing out by joining the EU because it's a large country. It's not joining the Eurozone. All of the money is going to go to the smaller new accessing countries and not to Poland. And we indeed see that the electorate is initially very flat. But then with the sort of increased rhetoric of LPR and PiS, it actually does become sort of more Eurosceptic, particularly here in 2011. And finally, the third question, which is the question about personal benefits. So this is a question which we probably would expect least likely parties to actually be driving polarization of the electorate, because parties probably don't know very well about what a specific person can benefit from the EU, or what it can lose from the EU. And here I would say that the distributions basically remain, they don't seem to be differentiated according to parties. Although the agrarian and the Eurosceptic parties, which were sort of more Eurosceptical towards the end of the 2009 and 2011, here is sort of like solidly distributed around 4. So what seems to be what we seem to be able to infer from these figures, these visualizations, is there's not much support for the hypothesis about Downian parties, namely that electorates were polarized on the EU accession issue, and in response to that polarization, parties either emerged or reprogrammed their platforms to sort of match up with what the public wanted. So in conclusion, polarization has been identified as one of the causes of democratic backsliding, but it's not really clear in many instances whether it's the same polarization that authors are talking about. So sometimes it's polarization of parties, sometimes it's polarization of the electorate, sometimes it's polarization of a representative citizen relative to party elites. So we looked at theories talking about 2 possibilities: either that parties exploit exogenous issues to carve out cleavages and rhetorically polarize electorates around those 2 issues, or mass publics polarizes on a new cleavage completely independently of party elites, and parties, being responsible, develop platforms that match the electorate. But at least when it comes to using the EU accession cleavage, we don't find a lot of support that electorates in these 6 main Polish parties were differentiating on any questions that measure EU accession attitudes early on. So this seems to be disconfirming the Downian hypothesis. So that's all I have. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Monika and Ipek. Now we're going to go over to Annie Meng, who is from the University of Virginia.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This is a super interesting conference so far, and I love it when we have comparative panels alongside American panels. So I got to think about 2 really exciting papers. And I think before I get into the more specific paper comments, I kind of just wanted to take a step back really fast and summarize what I think is like kind of a big theme that emerges from both of these papers that is both really interesting and I think really helpful in kind of helping us think through the role of polarization and democratic backsliding more generally. And so I think that a big idea that comes out of both of these papers that's not necessarily brand new, but I think is important, is this idea that polarization is endogenous, right? Like in a lot of existing models and a lot of political economy models, we often model polarization as exogenous, or it's often framed as something that like happens to us, right, or is like an unintended consequence. But I think that what these 2 papers are really highlighting is the fact that polarization can be changed and manipulated by politicians, right? It's not something that just happens. It can be an intentional tactic. It can be something that elites deliberately engineer, right? And so I think maybe a big idea that we might want to kind of think about going forward is, rather than thinking about polarization as a cause of backsliding, should we instead be thinking about polarization as a tactic of backsliding, right? Also, just to give you a little bit of background in terms of why I'm always extremely pessimistic about elite intentions, all my research is on authoritarian regimes. So I'm always very suspicious of elites, including of democratic elites. So maybe that's why I have a bit of a sense of pessimism about these things. But okay, so going a little more specifically into these two very excellent papers. First, I'll talk about the Divide and Conquer paper, and then I'll talk about the Nalepa and Chinar paper. So for the Divide and Conquer paper, and by the way, huge props to the Moscow team for staying up late and presenting, even though it's really late over there. So I really love that this paper ties institutional rules and our selection of institutions to corresponding levels of polarization, right? I think that, again, with the idea that polarization is endogenous, this is kind of like a very clean and nice way for us to think about the effects of institutional rules, right? So my big question, though, with the model is that I think the model takes a really passive stance on parties and party elites and parliamentaries, right? And I'm wondering why, and I'm wondering if maybe we need to rethink this a little bit, right? So in the model, you assume that in parliamentary elections, parties aren't acting strategically, and whereas you assume that in presidential systems, presidential candidates do act very strategically, right? And the parliamentary case is basically just kind of the baseline case in the model. And I'm wondering if this is empirically true, right? So for instance, Monika and Ipek's paper showed that party elites are really strategic, right? And whether or not they're kind of leading their electorate, their constituents to be, to have certain views, and party elites can absolutely change them and try to manipulate them, even in parliamentary systems, right? And even more generally, there's a lot of research about how party elites are strategic actors in parliamentary systems, just like everybody else, right? So I'm wondering if maybe this is too much of an assumption to be making, or if you do want to keep this assumption, I think that we maybe just need a lot more justification about it, right? So turning to the empirical analysis. So for your dependent variable, you use VDEM expert survey data, and where the question was basically, is society polarized into antagonistic political camps? So this was hand coded by experts on an ordinal scale ranked 0 to 4. So this might be like a totally unfair question because, as Monika mentioned, it's just really, really hard to get cross-national data on this. So I'm very, very sympathetic to that. I'm wondering if there are any other sources of data for this. I'm just a little bit worried because this is a really subjective coding, right? The VDEM data was hand coded by experts. It's just like, do you think that it was very antagonistic on like a 0 to 4 scale? Different experts might have different perceptions about what a 1 versus a 2 means and stuff like that, right? Just kind of general worries we have about kind of cross-national expert survey stuff. I'm also a little bit worried that levels of repression might be affecting this response, right? And I'm going to talk a lot more about kind of general levels of authoritarianism in a second, but I'm wondering if maybe you could be tapping into like repression or censorship as well here, right? The measure seems a little bit muddied. I looked up the VDEM codebook and the description of the variable is listed as societies are highly polarized if supporters of opposing political camps are reluctant to engage in friendly interactions, right? So you can imagine how other things going on in authoritarian or like kind of electoral authoritarian regimes like repression or censorship could maybe like affect how friendly everyone wants to be in terms of like engaging with across partisan lines, right? I was also wondering why you compressed the magnitude of change. So you coded as a dummy variable, 1 if polarized, if polarization changed, 0 otherwise. But going from a 0 to a 4 is very different from going to a 0 to a 1, right? And so I'm wondering if maybe, the other thing is, this also doesn't tell us about the overall levels of polarization, right? Like polarization can be very high but not change, 4 to a 4. Or it can be very low and it increase slightly, 0 to a 1, right? So I'm wondering if it would maybe help to just do 2 versions of the dependent variable. So one is just the raw polarization score. And then the second version is you calculate the change, but don't compress it to a dummy, right? For the independent variable, I was curious how you code semi-presidential systems, right? And so when the system is like kind of mixed and has aspects of kind of both presidential and parliamentary system, what is your expectation here about levels of polarization? Another related question: in parliamentary systems, the head of state may or may not be subject to a vote of no confidence by the legislature, right? So parliamentary systems just kind of vary in terms of how constrained the heads of state are by their own parties or by, the legislature. So I was wondering both how you code that and kind of what your expectations are in terms of how they would behave. I was also wondering what are the overall differences in levels of polarization between presidential versus parliamentary systems? So you focus a lot on change in polarization, but what are like the baseline levels of polarization in these two systems, right? The other thing that I was wondering is, what about non-election years? Right? Is it that presidential systems just always have higher levels of polarization and they get triggered even more in election years? Or maybe it could be that polarization can also be really high in parliamentary systems, but it's just more constant. They just don't get this kind of up and down around election years. So I was kind of curious about that. My last point about this paper is, so I have this kind of general concern about that comes out of the fact that institutional choice is endogenous, right? So I was wondering if maybe we should think a little bit more about that. So, it's not a surprise that most electoral autocracies are presidential systems, right? So, the choice of whether to have a presidential system or a parliamentary system is not random. This is a choice that's engineered by elites when they're writing the constitutions. But right now, I think the party is largely taking the existence of regime choice as given, right? And one of the reasons why I was thinking about this is because I'm wondering if your measure of presidential systems might just really be tapping into a measure of authoritarianism, right? So most consolidated democracies, unlike the US, are parliamentary systems. And so it could be the case that the presidential systems really just reflect the more autocratic cases where the incumbents are less constrained to use a whole variety of strategies, some pseudo-illicit strategies, including misinformation, everything else that autocratic incumbents can do to win elections, right? And furthermore, these other strategies that they can do could also be influencing polarization beyond just the information channel that you're talking about, right? For instance, it's possible that in presidential, AKA more autocratic elections, maybe those elections increase polarization because when the incumbent or when the ruling party tampers with ballot boxes, that really pisses people off, right? Or maybe high levels of repression are like really pissing people off, right? So two things to maybe kind of try to check for this or address this is one possibility is to run a robustness check where you just drop autocracies, right? So polity score lower than 6, just drop those cases. I don't know if this cuts down the sample too much, unfortunately, but if you're able to do that, then maybe that's a good possibility. Another thing to do is just to try to add additional controls, maybe to kind of address some of these concerns. So, levels of repression, censorship, integrity of elections, et cetera. VDEM has data on this. Although, again, with the caveat that the scoring is very subjective. Maybe just kind of trying to control for more things that we might be concerned about that's going on in these kind of electoral authoritarian cases. Awesome. So now turning to the Nalepa and Chinar paper. So I also love this paper. I love that they kind of take this point that's kind of been taken for granted, especially in a lot of the kind of political economy papers on polarization that I've been reading. And the authors really try to understand where polarization comes from, right? Like, is it a fair assumption to assume that it comes from, the masses or that it comes from elites? So I really love this. And I think that the empirics of this paper are super useful. So my first big comment is actually kind of like a framing, it's a framing / substantive point. And so my point here is that right now the paper is very much centered around trying to kind of adjudicate this debate between, is it mass polarization or is it elite level polarization? But in this paper, so at least so far, you actually don't have data on elite polarization, right? And so I'm wondering if maybe this isn't quite the right framing or focus of it. So instead of framing things around elite polarization versus mass polarization, I wonder if maybe a better framing is just, do voter attitudes follow party cues, or do parties respond to voter attitudes, right? And I think that in the body of the paper, you're more kind of straightforward about that framing. But I think that maybe that's just a more accurate depiction of what you're doing, unless you wanted to add data on kind of elite polarization, which might be hard to get. But then from there, you have an implication for polarization, right? That helps us understand whether changes in attitudes starts at the top or comes from the bottom. Furthermore, I think what's really tricky when we're thinking about the polarization of elites is that there's actually two distinct possibilities here, right? Like, one possibility is that elites really are polarized in their beliefs, right? And they want to like impose these new beliefs onto their constituents. But a second possibility, drawing inspiration from the Divide and Conquer paper, is that this is all very instrumental, right? It could be that elites are not getting polarized at all. They have the same exact beliefs, but they want their party members to become more polarized, right? So then we're talking about elites weaponizing polarization rather than the polarization of elites, right? But just in general, I think because the data focuses on mass level polarization rather than elites, I just would be careful about saying things like, I would be careful about phrases like polarization in the electorate preceded polarization among elites or vice versa. Just to like put out an alternative hypothesis, I wonder if like one possibility, so this is me being very generous about elites and assuming that they're not being strategic in trying to weaponize polarization. What if something else that's going on actually is that, what if everybody, elites and the masses, are just like becoming more polarized together, right? Like, what if there's like something else that's just causing all of us to become more polarized? I don't know if you have elite level data with, over time. As you mentioned, this might be super hard to get. So I don't know if this is possible, but I don't know. Or even if do you have like access to like speeches or public statements on this? I would just be super curious to see whether elites were also like very, not distinguished on the EU issues like earlier on as well. So in the paper, it mentioned that the surveys are monthly. So I'm not sure if it would also be possible to test changes in public attitudes before or after a big push by the party to change their attitudes, right? Like, I don't know if it's possible to do this, like if there was an important speech or event where the party was like really trying to change attitudes about the EU. If there was monthly data, I'd be super interested to see whether there were changes in attitudes, like immediately following a big push by the party. A couple of final things that came to mind. One thing that actually really struck me when I was looking at your graphs in terms of levels of polarization, which were fascinating, but one thing that actually kind of struck me was I felt like I didn't see a ton of polarization. I don't know if I was just expecting something much worse, but most of the responses actually seemed like they were either normally or like pretty uniformly distributed, even in 2011, with the exception of like, very few parties, right? So, like I saw that, one instance of a drastic change in a single party was like the LPR in 2011 suddenly had like a very anti-EU stance. But in general, I was just like, oh, this isn't that bad in terms of polarization, right? So that then actually also led me to another conceptual question about polarization, which is, what if just one party takes a more extreme stance, but everyone else is like generally the same, right? Like, is this polarization, or, you know, does everybody need to like go to opposing poles? Or what happens if everyone is still kind of generally the same, but like one party just becomes more kind of radical? The final empirical question that I have is, I was a little curious what the non-EU issues looked like. Were there changes in attitudes for non-EU issues, right? So you mentioned that there's also data for separation of church and state, fiscal issues. You know, in general, were people changing their attitudes on all of these things in general? You know, it would be really interesting too to see if rhetoric coming from the party that's targeting a single issue can actually cause polarization for other things, right? Like maybe you're just like, okay, I'm totally on board with this party because the EU thing, I'm going to buy into all the other attitudes that they're proposing, right? I think that'd be super interesting to look at. Okay, so just to close out, to take another step back and kind of think about how these two really awesome papers can help us think about kind of bigger issues around polarization and implications for backsliding. So once again, I'm going to propose that maybe, you know, if polarization can be endogenously changed by politicians and institutions, should we be thinking about it as a tactic, one of many tactics that elites can leverage to undermine democracy rather than a cause of backsliding, right? I think that this is an important theme that has been brought up in this panel that we might want to think about. We obviously should, you know, not take polarization as exogenous, right? I think that both of these papers in different ways kind of give compelling evidence that we should stop modeling it as exogenous. But also, this led me to think about one more kind of big question that I've been wrestling with a lot. And this goes beyond the papers in this panel. But one thing that I really wrestle with is the connection between polarization and backsliding. And the question is, at the end of the day, how much does polarization really matter for backsliding if we think about it as a tactic, right? Is it just one out of many tools that elites can use and are going to use to concentrate power? Would elites have tried to autocratize anyway, right? If we think of polarization as something that they can just manipulate really easily. I don't know if this is like a optimistic or pessimistic question, but I think it's a big one that we should really think about. So yeah, thanks so much for letting me think about these two awesome papers, and I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Annie. Let me give the authors a chance to respond. So let's start with the Moscow team.
Okay, so let me just very quickly respond to the non-strategic nature of parliamentary parties in parliamentary elections. That's a very very fair, very good point. That's exactly what we take the stand here, right? And so the idea here, idea that we adopt here is sort of parallel to the empirical exercise. So in parliamentary systems, or in whatever ways that political parties in both types of systems can be strategic, they can actually induce some changes in polarizations. And the idea is to capture at least one particular way in the model that presidential systems might be sort of additionally strategic, and additionally, so they create an additional way or channel to induce further polarization. But I agree with the point that we take the political parties as completely non-strategic, and actually we should think about ways to maybe enrich the model a little bit, or think about how we can introduce some sort of strategic behavior of political parties themselves as well, and then see whether this additional strategic element that presidential elections carry can actually induce further lower polarization in different circumstances.
So first of all, I would like to thank our discussant, N, because I think that those were excellent comments, but I also think that they are manageable in terms of how we can improve the paper. So in terms of the model, I think that what we didn't mean that political parties are not strategic at all. What we meant is that presidential candidates have more space for being strategic. So I think that this is a plausible assumption, and I totally agree that political party elites, are strategic and they use these tactics. So I think that we would make this, assumption more explicit in the paper. And now regarding the empirical questions, so about the VDEM political polarization measure, I think that the simple answer is that we can do robustness checks, and we are very much familiar with the Esteban-Rey measure, which was also mentioned by other members of the symposium in the chat. We used it in our previous paper, so we can do that. And I think this is also an excellent suggestion, to use the change of polarization level, but without maybe compressing it into a binary level. But here, why we did it was because we are interested in the level of change in political polarization during the election campaign, rather than the level per se. But again, for robustness checks, I think it's doable. We do measure semi-presidential systems, I think, as presidential systems simply because they have presidential elections, right? And we kind of argue that presidential elections are more divisive and polarizing because of the figure of the president, right? So, and you also asked a very interesting question, what about non-election years and whether we have evidence that in general, presidential forms of government are more polarized than parliamentary. And we do have that analysis as well, actually, and it's very robust. But we kind of also, that's the analysis, to be honest, we started with, but, we thought that it might be too far away from the game theoretical setup because it's about electoral campaigns. So that's why kind of, the unit of analysis as election year made more sense. But we do have, evidence that on average, presidential forms of government are more polarized than parliamentary. And I'm pretty sure we used only democracies for that. We didn't, yes, we excluded autocracies. So we are actually thinking, since the question, we are actually thinking of putting those, back into the paper, maybe into the robustness checks as well. So we do control for authoritarian regimes, for political regime variable that at least, can mitigate some of your questions about whether we do not just catch authoritarianism. But I think that we can also control for other variables such as level of repression, censorship, and integrity for elections. So thanks again. The comments are excellent, and we like it that you like our major idea about endogenous polarization. So we will just do that. Thank you.
So Dina already, I think, answered most of what I would have answered as well, but only a few additions here. Actually, I do remember very well dividing the sample into democracies versus non-democracies. So it does work on that front. We are lucky. So we should be able to add it, I think, somewhere in the appendix, or I don't know, we will figure it out probably. Well, the issue of can we find another dependent variable is more problematic. We've already tried multiple options. The problem with Esteban-Rey measure, prior in another paper with Dina, we used this measure. However, we used world value surveys, and for many years they were missing, which meant that we had to extrapolate. That extrapolation did work when we were doing what we were doing at the time, which only focused on levels. But here, since we are only looking at election years and the change from T-1 to T, it's not possible to extrapolate that way, right? So we are losing a lot there. So it didn't seem to be possible. Other measures obviously can be used, but then we are losing a lot of countries, again, because systematic data is not available. So this is why we made the choice that we made. So maybe we need to justify it, but for the moment, seriously, I don't see any other dependent variables that would cover such a broad sample. So that's that semi-presidential systems comment I like, and I find it interesting because, again, for another project, we actually tested whether semi-presidential regimes would make a difference. They do actually make a blip if you look at the polarization levels overall. So semi-presidential systems seem to be less polarized than presidential, more polarized than parliamentary. So I think, we decided not to include it here because we weren't specifically focusing on systems, but rather on the type of executive election. So we didn't think it made immediate sense. So we could, I guess, again, try to incorporate it, but we would have to think how. Vote of no confidence is an aspect I never thought about, so admittedly, so I'm going to have to think about how that might have an effect. I don't know if colleagues have thought about it. And finally, actually, when we started this project quite a few years back, our initial idea was also that maybe polarization is just an elite tactic. And to this day, actually, I still believe that in many cases, especially being Turkish, I'm cynical now about elite intentions. In many cases, I believe that it is a strategy. But again, right, we would need to think how to get our heads around that, I guess, how to use that idea. We haven't figured out a clever way of doing that yet. So that's all I'll say. I'm not to steal other people's time.
Okay.
I'll stop here.
Thanks to the Moscow crew. Monika.
Yeah, so thank you, Annie, very much. I'll follow up with a more detailed email of responses, but just some clarifying answers. So yeah, no, the finding that there's not much polarization is kind of exactly the point that we wanted to make. The only evidence that there's like some separation is basically in 2009 on the liberal side, there seems to be some Euro enthusiasm, and in 2011 on the Eurosceptic side, you see like some evidence of it, but there's not much, and it's like a decade's worth of data. So we have basically two choices, I think, to drive that point home. The first is basically to find another issue where voters do separate, right? So it's like clear that, it's not just, all voters in Poland are uninformed and they just like simply have no clue on any of these thermometer questions. So we could do that with, and IPEC will know better what kind of issues we had in those surveys, but I think they were summarized in the paper and you recall them correctly. Another thing that we could do is we could basically look at the second decade, so 2011 through 2021, and show that polarization has taken place, because I'm absolutely positive that currently the electorate is very divided on that. On the elite polarization, yeah, so we actually do have data that's similar to what Americanists use to measure polarization of elites, but it's worthless in the parliamentarian context because parties are disciplined. So basically they just vote as their parties tell them to. The closest that we could use this probably would be candidate surveys. But I think that would take the paper in a completely different direction, and I don't think it's entirely necessary. So yeah, but thank you so much for those comments. And can I use the fact that I have the floor to ask?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I also thought that the parliamentarianism was a little bit the parliamentary regimes were a little bit strawmanned. But when I was looking at your presentation, I thought that you actually could recover most of your findings with just looking at presidential regimes, because essentially the comparative statics that you were talking about were all on the sort of that upside down V-shaped curve. And you don't really need that baseline, because I think that whenever you characterize parliamentary regimes as, parties just like run on their platforms truthfully, I mean, I think that that's going to give you a little bit of pushback. And also, it was not clear to me when you were using the VDEM data, the countries in your sample, they have had elections conducted according to majoritarian rules the whole time. So why would there? So it seemed to be that your model assumed that you would have a change in the way of organizing elections or a change in regime, that would then cause an increase in polarization, but the regime is constant the whole time. So that I was not very clear about how your statistical model worked there. So all countries that are presidential regimes have elections that are majoritarian. So why would they have a low initial polarization in the first place if presidentialism is supposed to increase polarization? I was a little hung up on that, but maybe I didn't understand your statistical model fully.
Well, the thing is, if regime of a country changes over time, which has happened in a few cases, we would capture that, obviously, right? And countries that have no elections are excluded anyway, right? So that's not even by choice. We're using election years, so that's out. And we are not saying that obviously government type is the only determinant of levels of polarization. So you would expect that some countries are parliamentary but still have high levels of polarization due to XYZ factor. So, and others, like we'll have presidential systems, however, not the other maybe structural conditions in place, so they will have lower levels of polarization. So if there is another point to this I'm not seeing, please, correct me.
So does your model say that like a higher number of presidential elections will increase polarization? So no. Yeah, I need to read the paper more carefully. Sorry.
Yeah. So the idea here with the parliamentary elections is that so I guess it could be possible to introduce some sort of strategic element in the parliamentary elections as well. And then what we will get is some additional change in the polarization level after parliamentary elections. So so even if you do that, my expectation would be that with this additional let's say channel that the presidential elections work into increasing or decreasing polarization, we would basically have something like two graphs where the presidential elections sort of exacerbate the polarization even further, and then they will reduce the polarization even further in some the other cases. So my guess is actually is something like this. So in a sense, we the choice of taking parliamentary election of political parties and non-strategic is sort of a normalization, strategic normalization assumption in a sense. But of course, this is a point that we should think a bit more deeply into, both from the modeling aspect and I guess the empirical side as well.
Any other points that people want to raise? Any issues, questions? Okay.
I quickly wanted to say,
go ahead. Yeah, please.
Thanks to Annie. I am just not sure how strong my internet connection is because I am currently at a hotel with very low Wi-Fi. So
far,
please
so good.
Please bear with me if I disconnect. But thanks so much for all these great comments. We will take a more detailed look into the data set, but I believe we had questions concerning the economy and like privatization. So we can take a look into how people differ on those dimensions. And point well taken about whether polarization is a tactic or a cause. I personally think it's both. It's a cause for them to get into place, but then it becomes a tactic for them to stay in power. But this is a way to get into how they actually use polarization as a tactic to stay in power. And then let me just take a look into my notes. And then we will take a look into the elite data, but as Monika said, or Professor Nalepa said, parliamentary data using traditional measures to measure polarization is not efficient, but we will take a look into it, the framing issue that you just discussed. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks to the Moscow team. Thanks to the Chicago team. Thanks to Annie Meng in Austin, Texas. And that's a wrap for the second panel of the Polarization Symposium, the Comparative Politics panel. And we'll take a little bit of a break. I wrote this in as a lunch break, and it's more of a West Coast time lunch break, right? And we'll reconvene at 12:20 Pacific time for the third panel. Thanks, guys.